On a cold Montana morning, a chestnut horse with short, awkward legs was dragged into the auction ring, and the crowd burst out laughing. No one wanted him. No one believed in him, except for a poor boy named Ethan, who spent every dollar he had to bring the horse home. What followed was a journey of heartbreak, defiance, and an ending that left the entire town stunned. The Montana sun poured down in golden sheets, baking the dirt roads and glinting off the polished chrome of pickup trucks lined up outside the county fairgrounds. It was auction day, the kind of event that pulled ranchers from miles around. Men in clean Stetsons leaned against the railings, their boots dustless and new, while women in pressed dresses shaded their eyes with straw hats. A band played faintly from a speaker near the refreshment tent, but the real music came from the murmurs of money and the nervous shifting of hooves. Inside the corral, horses gleamed like bronze statues, each one paraded with pride. Long-legged bays strutted under the watchful eyes of breeders, their muscles rippling as if every stride had been rehearsed for this very moment. The air carried the sharp smell of hay and the faint tang of sweat, a scent that spoke of both labor and promise. Buyers leaned forward with calculating gazes, already imagining trophies and stud fees. And then the laughter began. From the far side of the pen, a chestnut horse was led in, his coat glowing like fire in the afternoon light. He should have been beautiful. He was beautiful, but his legs were short, oddly stocky compared to the elegance of the others. Every step seemed uncertain, as though the ground itself mocked his existence. His ears flicked nervously at the sound of chuckles. Someone whistled low. "Look at that little thing," a rancher said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Barely tall enough to pull a cart, let alone race." Another voice followed, sharp with scorn. "That's not a horse for men who dream big. That's a yard ornament." The auctioneer, a man with a booming voice that usually commanded respect, hesitated for a moment before forcing a smile. "Next we have a young chestnut gelding. Strong body, good temperament, and still plenty of years ahead. Who'll start me at 1,000? Silence stretched thin. Somewhere in the crowd, a champagne cork popped, and the fizzing sound carried further than the auctioneer's plea. Then came a burst of laughter, raw and cruel, echoing off the white tent poles. The horse, Smoky, though he didn't yet bear that name, shifted on his hooves. His dark eyes darted to the edges of the crowd, searching, pleading in a way only those who've felt rejection recognize. He tugged against the lead rope, but the handler jerked him back into line. His head lowered, not in submission, but in shame. At the edge of the arena, unnoticed by most, stood a lanky young man in a faded shirt and scuffed boots. Ethan Miller kept his hands shoved deep into his pockets, the brim of his cap shadowing his eyes. He hadn't come here to buy. Truth be told, he could barely afford the gas that had carried him into town. His job at the gas station paid little, and the money he earned mucking stalls at a neighbor's ranch barely covered groceries for his grandmother and kid sister. But as his gaze locked on the chestnut, something stirred. Ethan knew the weight of being dismissed, of being measured against standards you could never meet. He had felt it since the night his father died in a rodeo accident, leaving behind debts and a silence that hung heavy over the Miller house. Folks looked at Ethan the way they now looked at the chestnut, too small for the fight, too ordinary for glory. The auctioneer tried again, his voice cracking with forced optimism. 900? 8? 7? He paused, shifting in his boots as the crowd erupted in whispers. Someone snorted and muttered, "You'd be lucky to give him away." Ethan's pulse thudded in his ears. He could feel it, an invisible tether pulling between himself and the horse. Smokey lifted his head then, just slightly, and in that fleeting moment their eyes met. The noise of the auction fell away. It was as if both boy and horse recognized the same wound in each other. Abandoned, unwanted, yet still breathing, still stubborn enough to stand. A rancher in a pressed vest shook his head. Not worth the feed. He turned his back, signaling the auctioneer to move on. And Ethan's hand went up. It wasn't steady. His fingers trembled, as if even his body knew he had no right to bid. But the word left his throat before doubt could stop it. 300. The laughter roared again, harsher this time. 300? That won't buy the saddle off my mare, a man barked. The auctioneer stared at Ethan, searching his face as if expecting him to back down. But Ethan didn't lower his hand. That's all I've got, he said, his voice thin but clear enough to cut through the noise. The handler holding the chestnut's lead rope smirked, as if amused by the humiliation unfolding. But Smokey, still nameless, still shaking, stood taller. His ears pricked forward, his eyes fixed on Ethan like a lifeline in a storm. The auctioneer sighed, shoulders sagging under the weight of the spectacle. Sold, he muttered, almost embarrassed. The gavel struck the block with a dull crack. Sold to the boy in the back for $300. The crowd howled. Some slapped each other on the back, amused at the foolishness. Others shook their heads, pitying the wasted money. Ethan ignored them all. His heart hammered so hard he could barely breathe. He pushed through the jeers until he reached the corral. The chestnut shuffled nervously, the whites of his eyes showing. Ethan raised a hand slowly, carefully, as though approaching a frightened child. His palm brushed the horse's neck, warm and damp with nervous sweat. You're safe now, Ethan whispered. The chestnut exhaled sharply, the tension in his body melting under that touch. For the first time since entering the arena, he stopped trembling. And in that fragile silence, Ethan knew. This wasn't a purchase. This was a beginning. The laughter from the auction still rang in Ethan's ears as he led the chestnut out of the fairgrounds. The crowd had already moved on to the next horse, forgetting him as quickly as they had mocked him. But Ethan carried the weight of those voices like stones in his pocket. The gelding's hooves clopped unevenly on the gravel path, hesitant with every step. Dust swirled around them in the late afternoon light, painting both boy and horse in the same tired color of resilience. Ethan didn't own a trailer. He didn't own much of anything beyond the second-hand truck parked at the edge of the lot, its paint long faded and the tailgate tied with baling twine. He tightened the rope halter he'd borrowed from a ranch hand and coaxed the horse forward. The chestnut resisted at first, pulling back as though uncertain if this new human would abandon him too. Ethan murmured softly, his voice a low rhythm. It's all right, boy. Just a little further. We'll figure it out. The horse flicked an ear back toward him, listening. By the time they reached the truck, the sun was sinking behind the wide Montana hills. Ethan improvised, fastening boards across the bed of the pickup to make a makeshift stall. It wasn't pretty, but it was safe enough for the short drive home. He climbed into the cab, hands shaking as he turned the key. $300 was gone, a fortune for someone like him. And all he had in return was a nervous chestnut with short legs and a gaze that clung to him like a question. The gravel road wound back toward the Miller homestead, a patch of land that had seen better days. The fence posts leaned like tired old men, and the barn, more a collection of weathered boards than a building, creaked in the wind. Ethan parked beside the house and jumped down, boots crunching in the dirt. He opened the truck bed and carefully guided the chestnut down the improvised ramp. The horse balked, eyes wide at the unfamiliar surroundings, but Ethan steadied him with a firm hand on his neck. The screen door creaked, and his grandmother stepped onto the porch. Helen Miller had silver hair pinned into a bun and lines etched deep around her eyes, each one carved by years of work and worry. She folded her arms across her apron and looked at the horse, then at Ethan. "Lord have mercy, Ethan. What have you brought home now?" Before he could answer, a smaller voice squealed in delight. Lily came running barefoot across the yard, her braids bouncing, her laughter like wind chimes. "Is he ours?" "Ethan, is he really ours?" Ethan knelt, pulling the rope a little closer, letting the horse sniff the dust and the scent of home. "Yeah, Lil. He's ours now." The chestnut lowered his head, cautiously, nostrils flaring as Lily reached up with small hands. He didn't bolt. Instead, he blew a warm breath against her palm, as if recognizing innocence when the world had only offered him ridicule. Lily giggled and pressed her face against his neck. "He smells like the sun." Grandma Helen sighed, shaking her head slowly. "You spent money we don't have, Ethan." Her voice was tired, but not cruel. She looked at the horse again, then at the boy who had never truly stopped grieving. "This won't be easy. Feed costs money. Vet bills cost money. Dreams don't keep the lights on." "I know," Ethan admitted, his throat tightening. He had no grand speech, only the truth. But I couldn't leave him there. Nobody wanted him. Silence fell, broken only by the rustle of dry grass. Helen studied her grandson, the lines in her face softening. She saw the same fire in him that his father once carried, a fire that had cost them dearly. Finally, she pressed a hand to the railing and said, "Then he's your responsibility. You'll work twice as hard if you have to. Don't let that animal suffer because of your pride." Ethan nodded, relief and fear colliding in his chest. He turned back to the horse, stroking the chestnut's warm neck. "You hear that, boy? You and me. We're in this together." That night, after Lily had been coaxed inside and Helen closed the kitchen curtains, Ethan stood in the dim barn with a lantern flickering against the wood. The chestnut shifted restlessly in the stall, the old boards creaking beneath his hooves. Ethan leaned on the rail, watching him. "I'll call you Smokey," he whispered. "Not because you're gray, but because you remind me of fire after it's burned down. Not flashy, not bright, but still alive, still warm." The horse's ears twitched at the sound of his new name. He turned, meeting Ethan's gaze with eyes that no longer darted, but lingered. In that stillness, boy and horse stood together. Two outsiders bound not by victory, not by wealth, but by the quiet promise of not leaving each other behind. And when the lantern flame danced higher for an instant, Ethan almost believed the world had just shifted, however slightly, in their favor. The next morning dawned quiet, the kind of Montana silence that comes before the wind begins to stir. Ethan rose early, long before Lily stirred in her bed or his grandmother lit the stove. The barn smelled of hay and dust, and Smokey stood inside, his chestnut coat glowing faintly in the lantern's glow. He eyed Ethan warily at first, but when the boy stepped closer, his ears tilted forward instead of back. It was the smallest sign of trust, but enough to stir something in Ethan's chest. As he brushed the horse's flank with an old worn curry comb, Ethan thought about the $300 now missing from his pocket. It had been every cent of his savings from the gas station, money meant for groceries, maybe for fixing the truck's brakes before winter. He knew his grandmother's words were right. feed and care for a horse would not come cheap. Yet when Smokey turned his head and let out a soft sigh, the kind that rippled through the stall like a confession, Ethan knew he'd made the only choice he could live with. Later that week, word of the auction spread quickly through the small town. At the feed store, men leaned against sacks of grain, chuckling about the fool boy who spent his wages on a worthless horse. At the diner, waitresses whispered behind their aprons, glancing at Ethan when he came in for coffee. Even at the gas station, customers grinned and asked if his pony could pump fuel as well as he could. Each comment stung, but Ethan learned to keep his head down. Pride was a fragile luxury he couldn't afford. But Smokey heard those voices too. Horses have a way of sensing the weight carried by their people, and the gelding grew restless whenever Ethan returned from town with his jaw tight and shoulders heavy. In the evenings, when Lily insisted on bringing him carrots stolen from the garden, Smokey softened again, lowering his big head so she could stroke his nose. It was in those moments Ethan reminded himself the world's opinion didn't matter. What mattered was here, in the quiet between him, his sister, and the horse nobody wanted. One Saturday afternoon, Ethan was repairing the fence line when a pickup truck rolled up the dirt road, raising a trail of dust. Behind the wheel was Travis Coleman, his father's wealth stamped into the shine of his boots and the smug curve of his smile. He leaned out the window, eyes scanning the ragged pasture until they landed on Smokey. "So it's true," Travis drawled. "You bought yourself a lawn ornament? Short legs, crooked stance. Boy, you sure know how to pick 'em." His laughter spilled into the dry air, sharp as barbed wire. Ethan's hands clenched around the hammer he was holding, but he said nothing. He turned back to the fence post, driving the nail in harder than he needed to. Smokey, standing nearby, shifted uneasily at the sound of Travis's voice, his ears flattening for a moment before flicking back toward Ethan. "Don't worry," Travis continued. "When Dad's horses sweep the county fair this fall, nobody will even remember your mutt. Unless, of course, you parade him out there for another laugh." He revved the engine and drove off, leaving a cloud of grit that clung to Ethan's skin long after the truck disappeared. That night, Ethan sat in the barn with Smokey. The gelding stood quietly, munching on the last of the hay. Ethan leaned against the rail, his voice barely more than a whisper. "They think I wasted my money. Maybe I did. But I see something in you, Smokey. I don't know how, but I do." The horse lifted his head, hay dangling from his mouth, and studied him with those deep, dark eyes. It was not a promise, not yet. But it was not a refusal. Either days slipped into weeks. Ethan rose earlier, pushing himself harder at the gas station, then coming home to work with Smokey. He led the gelding through the pasture, teaching him to walk beside him without tugging, then to trot in a circle, guided only by the rope and his voice. Smokey stumbled often, his short legs awkward against the uneven ground. But each time he stumbled, he righted himself quicker than before, as if unwilling to surrender to the world's judgment. One evening, while the horizon burned orange, Lily clapped her hands as Smokey completed a clumsy trot without breaking stride. "He's trying, Ethan." "He's really trying." Her laughter floated across the pasture, and for the first time since the auction, Ethan let himself smile without hesitation. He didn't know what future awaited them. He didn't know if Smokey could ever prove himself to anyone beyond the fences of their small farm. But as the last rays of sunlight washed over the chestnut's coat, making it shine like embers, Ethan realized something important. The unexpected bid at the auction hadn't been about money or pride or even defiance. It had been about recognition. the moment two outsiders found each other in a world that had no place for either of them. And that, Ethan thought, was worth more than any ribbon or trophy the Colemans could ever flaunt. Evening shadows stretched long across the Miller homestead as Ethan leaned the pitchfork against the barn wall. The yard was quiet, except for the low hum of crickets and the occasional groan of boards shifting in the breeze. Smokey stood in the corral, his chestnut coat catching the last red of the sun, and for the first time he looked less like an animal discarded and more like he belonged to someone. Still, belonging didn't mean comfort. The barn was barely standing, the fencing patched with wire and rope, and the hay pile shrank faster than Ethan's paychecks could replace it. Inside the house, the air smelled of cornbread and wood smoke. Helen sat at the kitchen table with her reading glasses low on her nose, bills spread before her like a battlefield. Ethan slipped in quietly, washing his hands at the sink, but she spoke without looking up. "Feed store called. Said you bought grain on credit again?" Ethan dried his hands on his jeans. "We needed it." He needed it. She finally raised her gaze, the lamplight reflecting in her tired eyes. "That horse will eat us out of house and home, Ethan." "You've taken on more than you realize." Before he could answer, Lily bounced into the room, a streak of energy that cut through the tension. "Smokey let me braid his mane today," she announced, her cheeks flushed. She plopped onto a chair and pulled at the crust of cornbread cooling on the counter. "He's not scary anymore." "He's sweet." Helen's expression softened at the mention of the horse, but only for a moment. "Sweet doesn't pay the electric bill," she murmured. Still, when Ethan looked away, she slid half her cornbread toward Lily and said, "Just remember, darling, animals depend on us, and we can't afford to fail them." Later, when dishes were stacked and Lily tucked in bed, Ethan went back outside. The night air was sharp, filled with the scent of sagebrush and dust. Smokey stood waiting, ears pricked as Ethan approached. The gelding nickered softly, and Ethan ran a hand down his neck, feeling the warmth under his fingers. "This place isn't much," Ethan said quietly, "but it's home. And somehow, you make it feel less broken." He pulled a handful of oats from his pocket, the last of what they had until payday. Smokey crunched them happily, and Ethan leaned against the rail, his head heavy with thoughts. The days that followed fell into rhythm. Ethan's mornings started before dawn, shoveling stalls, refilling water troughs with buckets because the pump was failing again. Smokey tested every knot and fence board, pawing the ground until Ethan learned which corners to reinforce. Some evenings, Lily sat on the top rail of the corral, legs swinging, singing off-key tunes while Smokey trotted in lazy circles, growing more confident with each lap. But there were nights when doubt crept in. Ethan sat at the edge of his bed, staring at the cracked ceiling, wondering if his father would call him foolish too. The house creaked with every gust, and he could hear Helen moving restlessly in her room, the worry never leaving her. Through it all, Smokey remained a constant, flawed, imperfect, but there, like a quiet answer Ethan hadn't known he'd been searching for. One Sunday afternoon, after mending yet another section of fence, Ethan caught himself laughing as Smokey snorted and shoved his nose into the boy's shoulder, nudging him toward the bucket of water. It was a small thing, a gesture almost human. Ethan poured the water, watched Smokey drink, and whispered, "You'll never be what they wanted, and maybe neither will I. But maybe that's the point." The yard was still shabby, the barn still leaning, and the stack of bills on Helen's table still thick. Yet under the fading Montana sky, boy and horse stood in the middle of it all. Two lives stitched together, in a place where the world expected nothing. And in that expectation of nothing, something fragile and remarkable began to grow. The first chill of autumn crept across the valley, curling through the grass and clinging to the barn roof. Each morning, the fog rolled low over the pasture, softening the fences and erasing the horizon. Ethan rose before dawn, pulling on boots still damp from yesterday, and stepped into the gray quiet. Smokey waited, his chestnut coat damp with dew, steam rising faintly from his breath. In that fog, the world seemed to shrink until it was only boy and horse, breathing together in the half-light. Training wasn't glamorous. There were no polished saddles, no arenas lined with white fences, just uneven ground, tufts of brittle grass, and Ethan's persistence. He led Smokey in wide circles, the rope loose enough to trust, taut enough to guide. The gelding resisted at first, jerking his head, stomping with impatience, but Ethan spoke in steady tones, words more rhythm than meaning. "Easy now." That's it. Just one more step. Each circle grew smoother, each trot less clumsy. On mornings when the fog was thick enough to blur Lily's voice calling from the porch, Ethan felt as though he and Smokey were the only two souls in existence. The sound of hooves muffled in damp earth, the occasional snort breaking the hush. It was a language that belonged only to them. In those hours, Ethan forgot the whispers in town, the weight of bills, even the memory of his father's accident. All that remained was the simple act of showing up, again and again, until something fragile took root. But not every day went smoothly. Some mornings, Smokey balked, refusing to step over fallen branches or shying away from shadows. Ethan's patience frayed, and frustration bubbled in his chest. Once, in a burst of anger, he tugged the rope too hard, and Smokey reared slightly, eyes wide with fear. The sight jolted Ethan, shame flooding in before the horse's hooves even touched the ground. He stepped back, lowering his voice. "I'm sorry. That's not how this works." Gradually, he learned to wait. When Smokey froze, Ethan stood still beside him, breathing slowly until the horse's trembling eased. Sometimes it took minutes, sometimes longer, but each victory, no matter how small, left its mark. They weren't chasing speed or glory, they were building trust, brick by invisible brick. Lily often joined after school, her laughter carrying through the fog. She skipped along the fence line, humming, her braids swinging. Smokey would prick his ears at her voice, his tension melting as she sang nonsense tunes about wildflowers and summer rain. Helen watched from the porch, arms folded, her face unreadable. She didn't stop them, but she didn't join either. Worry weighed heavier on her than the fog itself. One morning, while Ethan led Smokey through a makeshift obstacle of logs and stones, the gelding stumbled and nearly fell. Ethan caught the rope, steadying him, and for a moment their eyes locked, both startled, both aware of how close they had come to breaking the fragile progress they'd made. Smokey snorted, then stepped forward, clumsy but determined. Ethan exhaled and followed. By the time the fog lifted each day, the valley stretched wide again, sunlight burning away the mist. Ethan wiped sweat from his brow, his shirt damp and clinging. Smokey's coat gleamed copper under the rising sun, the awkwardness of his short legs less noticeable when framed by resilience. They hadn't transformed overnight, but something undeniable was shifting. Standing at the fence, Ethan whispered into the quiet, "They think you're nothing, but I see you." "Smokey, I see what you're trying to be." The horse flicked an ear, tail swishing, as if acknowledging the vow. And as the morning haze dissolved, Ethan realized these foggy dawns weren't just training sessions. They were confessions, the kind made without words, where faith was measured not in results, but in the willingness to show up when no one else believed. By late October, the mornings grew sharper, the fog thinner, but the air biting cold. The cottonwoods along the creek had shed their last leaves, and the fields lay brown and brittle under the wind. Ethan and Smokey worked in the pasture despite the chill, carving out a rhythm that belonged to no one else. Each circle of training, each hesitant trot, was a defiance of the town's laughter. But the world outside their small farm had not forgotten. One Saturday, Ethan drove into town for feed, with Lily skipping beside him and Smokey's rope halter looped over his arm like a badge of quiet pride. As they crossed the lot toward the store, a voice rose behind them, smooth as oil and sharp as broken glass. "Well, if it isn't Miller and his circus pony." Travis Coleman leaned against the hood of his father's gleaming truck, arms folded, boots polished so clean they caught the sunlight. A few boys his age clustered near him, laughter already bubbling in their throats. Smokey stopped short, the rope tugging gently in Ethan's hand, as if the horse too sensed the sting behind those words. Ethan kept walking, but Travis's voice carried after him. "How's it feel, spending your last dime on a lawn ornament?" "Bet he's slower than a church hymn." The boys howled, their laughter echoing off the metal feed bins. Lily spun around, her cheeks flushed pink. "Smokey's not slow," she shouted, her small voice trembling with anger. Travis grinned wider. "Careful, little Miller." "You'll hurt my feelings. Maybe when Daddy's horse wins the fair this year, we'll let you lead yours around for the kids to pet. Every circus needs a clown." Ethan stopped then, the halter rope tight in his fist. For a long moment he said nothing, the weight of silence heavier than words. Smokey shifted beside him, ears flicking nervously, tail swishing against the cold air. Finally, Ethan looked at Travis, his eyes steady but low. "Better to stand with a horse no one believes in than ride one everyone's afraid of without earning it." The laughter dimmed, but Travis only smirked. "We'll see about that." He climbed into the truck, slammed the door, and spun gravel as he drove away. Back at the farm, Ethan brushed Smokey's coat with slow, deliberate strokes. The horse leaned into the pressure, eyes half-lidded, as if grounding him. Lily sat on the fence, still fuming. "Why didn't you yell back?" He deserved it, Ethan shook his head. "Because yelling doesn't change a thing. We'll show them another way." That night, Helen set a steaming pot of stew on the table, her eyes flicking from Ethan to Lily, then to the window where Smokey's silhouette moved in the corral. "I heard Coleman's boy running his mouth again," she said. "Don't let his words put you in the ground. Pride's a heavy weight when you're already carrying so much." Ethan spooned stew into his bowl, the smell of beef and onions filling the kitchen. "It's not about pride, Grandma. It's about not letting him decide who we are." Later, under the cold stars, Ethan returned to the barn. Smokey lifted his head, ears forward, and stepped closer when Ethan entered the stall. The boy rested his forehead against the horse's neck, feeling the steady rhythm of breath and heartbeat. "They think we're nothing," he whispered. "But we'll prove them wrong. Quietly, one step at a time." Smokey sighed, warm breath fogging in the lantern light, and nudged Ethan's shoulder with his muzzle. The gesture was clumsy but certain, like a friend agreeing to a pact. For the first time since the auction, Ethan didn't hear the mocking voices when he closed his eyes. He heard only hooves against the earth, steady and strong, carrying them somewhere beyond ridicule, toward a place where belief mattered more than laughter. The air carried the brittle bite of early winter, sharp enough to sting the lungs. Ethan pulled his collar up against the wind as he led Smokey into the pasture. The ground was uneven, scattered with broken branches from last night's storm. Training had become a ritual, something Ethan clung to not just for Smokey's sake, but for his own. Each session felt like a step away from the ridicule Travis had thrown at him, a quiet answer spoken with effort instead of words. Smokey was restless that morning. His ears flicked back and forth, tail swishing, muscles taut beneath his chestnut coat. Ethan clicked his tongue softly and urged him forward. "Come on, boy." "Just like we've been practicing." Easy over the log. The gelding hesitated, nostrils flaring. Ethan tapped the rope lightly, his voice steady. Smokey gathered himself and jumped. For a heartbeat, Ethan felt triumph. Then the horse's hind legs clipped the edge of the log. His body lurched, hooves skidding in the wet earth, and in an instant Smokey went down hard. The sound of the fall cracked through Ethan's chest like a rifle shot. He dropped the rope and rushed forward, knees sinking in the mud. Smokey scrambled, eyes wide with panic, his legs thrashing as if the ground itself were trying to swallow him. "Easy, easy, boy," Ethan cried, his hands out but careful, knowing fear could turn hooves deadly. At last, Smokey found his footing, trembling as he stood. His chest heaved, steam rising from his body in the cold air. Ethan reached for him, but the gelding jerked away, whites of his eyes showing, every muscle rigid. The trust they'd been building felt like glass shattering on stone. Frustration burned in Ethan's throat, hot and reckless. "You can't keep doing this," he shouted, the words torn from somewhere deeper than the moment. "I need you to try. I need you to be more than what they think." His voice echoed across the empty field, crueler than he intended. Smokey flinched, then turned his head sharply, as if the sound itself had struck him. He backed away, nostrils flaring, until the rope tightened between them. Ethan froze, shame flooding in. His breath came hard, mixing with the horse's ragged snorts. For a long moment, neither moved. Boy and horse locked in a silence heavier than anger. When Ethan finally let the rope slip from his fingers, Smokey didn't bolt. He simply stood at a distance, head lowered, ears pinned in wary distrust. Ethan sank to the ground, mud soaking his jeans, and buried his face in his hands. The truth spilled out in a whisper meant for no one but the cold wind. "I don't know if I'm enough either." That night, the house was warm with the smell of soup, but Ethan hardly tasted it. Lily chattered about school, her voice bright, but Ethan barely heard. Helen watched him from across the table, her sharp eyes softened by concern. She didn't ask, she never pried, but she knew something had shifted. After dinner, Ethan slipped back to the barn. Smokey stood in the stall, head turned away, as though refusing the boy's presence. Ethan leaned against the wooden rail, the lantern's glow casting long shadows across the floor. "I messed up today," he admitted quietly. "I let my fear talk louder than my faith." "You didn't deserve that." The horse didn't move. Ethan stayed anyway, his voice low, steady, as he confessed to the silence. "Truth is, I'm scared. Scared I wasted what little I had. Scared Travis is right. Scared I'll never be enough." He swallowed hard, the words leaving him lighter but raw. "But I promise you this. I won't give up on you. Even if you never jump a fence, you won't be left behind again." Somewhere in the dark, Smokey shifted. His ears twitched toward Ethan's voice, and though he didn't step closer, the tension in his body eased. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was something. A crack in the wall of fear. Ethan blew out the lantern, leaving the barn to the hush of night. Outside, the stars were sharp against the black sky, endless and cold. He pulled his jacket tight and walked back toward the house, unsure of what tomorrow would bring. But behind him, in the darkness, Smokey let out a soft whicker, a sound so small it might have been lost to the wind. Except Ethan heard it. It was not trust restored, not a vow renewed, but it was enough to keep hope alive. The house had long since gone quiet. The fire in the stove had burned to embers, and the wind rattled the loose panes in the windows. Ethan lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the darkness pressing down heavier than the quilt across his chest. Sleep would not come. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Smokey hitting the ground, the flash of fear in those dark eyes, the way his own angry words had sliced through the trust they had been building. He rose quietly so as not to wake Lily or his grandmother, pulled on his boots without socks, and slipped into the cold night. The sky was clear, spattered with stars that seemed impossibly distant. Frost silvered the grass, crunching under his steps as he crossed to the barn. His breath came in pale clouds, and his hands trembled more from guilt than from cold. Inside, the barn smelled of hay and wood dampened by night air. Smokey stood in the corner of his stall, head lowered, shifting his weight uneasily when Ethan entered. The lantern light caught the sheen of his chestnut coat, and in that flicker Ethan saw the distance still between them. He set the lantern down and leaned against the stall rail, not reaching out, not daring to demand closeness. His voice was quiet, almost swallowed by the creak of rafters. I was wrong today. I let the anger in me talk louder than patience. I thought yelling would push you forward, but all it did was push you away. Smokey flicked an ear, but his body stayed rigid, as though waiting to see if words would be followed by force. Ethan clasped his hands together, feeling the rawness in his palms from the rope burns. I can't promise I won't make mistakes. I'm still figuring this out, just like you, but I promise I won't abandon you, not for being slow, not for stumbling, not for being exactly who you are. Minutes passed in silence. Ethan sank onto an overturned bucket, his shoulders slumped. He told Smokey things he had never spoken aloud, how the weight of his father's death still hung on him like a yoke, how people's laughter gnawed at him, how sometimes he doubted if he was building a future or just delaying failure. His voice cracked, but once he began, he could not stop. I think maybe I saw myself in you that day at the auction. Not perfect, not what they wanted, and maybe that's why I couldn't walk away. The chestnut shifted again, a low nicker rumbling in his throat. He stepped closer to the rail, his hooves soft on the straw. Ethan kept still, letting Smokey choose the distance. At last, the horse stretched his neck, muzzle brushing against Ethan's sleeve. It was tentative, the kind of gesture that could be withdrawn at any second, but it was also enough. A thread pulled tight between them. Ethan raised his hand slowly, resting it against Smokey's jaw. I'm not asking you to be something you're not, he whispered. I just want you to trust me enough to try, and I'll trust you back. The gelding breathed out, warm and steady, fogging the air between them. Ethan felt his own breathing slow in response, the panic that had gripped him all evening easing just a fraction. They stood like that, neither moving, until the lantern's flame sputtered low. When Ethan finally turned to leave, Smokey followed him to the stall gate, nudging, his shoulder once more before stopping. Outside, the cold wrapped around Ethan, but it no longer cut as deeply. He walked back toward the house with the first fragile sense that forgiveness had begun. Not full, not final, but a beginning. Back in his room, Ethan sat on the edge of his bed and whispered into the dark, "Tomorrow, we start again." The words weren't just a plan for training. They were a promise between a boy and a horse, sealed in the quiet hours of a Montana night. By the time November's winds swept across the valley, the fields had turned a brittle gold. The harvest season was underway, and the small town buzzed with the rhythm of tractors, wagons piled high with hay, and neighbors trading work for work. Ethan juggled shifts at the gas station with long hours helping in neighboring fields, stacking bales and hauling grain. Every dollar counted now, especially with Smokey in the barn eating through the feed faster than Ethan's wages could stretch. Yet in the middle of the harvest chaos, Ethan still carved out time for the chestnut. At dawn and dusk, while the town bustled in and out of the co-op, Ethan and Smokey practiced on the open ground behind the house. The fields, though rough and uneven, became their arena. He led Smokey through rows of hay stubble, over shallow ditches, around makeshift obstacles fashioned from barrels and fence posts. Smokey stumbled less often now, his short legs finding rhythm on the same ground that once betrayed him. His breath steamed in the cold air, steady as Ethan's own. Lily became a constant presence at the fence line. She would bring a pocket full of carrots and sit perched on the top rail, singing songs that had no melody but always made Smokey's ears flick. Sometimes she would giggle when the horse tried to reach her with his muzzle, lips twitching for treats. Those small moments stitched the evenings together, giving Ethan glimpses of something he had thought long gone. Joy without demand. Helen, meanwhile, kept her distance. She watched from the porch with her arms wrapped in her shawl, her face half hidden in the twilight. Ethan knew she worried every time she saw the dwindling woodpile or the stack of unpaid bills on the table. Still, she never pulled him away from the barn. Perhaps she understood what it meant to carry something fragile when the world called it foolish. One evening, as the sky deepened into the purple of approaching snow, Smokey balked at a new obstacle. A ditch that cut across the field, deeper than any he had faced. Ethan stood at the far side, rope slack in his hand, urging him softly. The gelding pawed at the dirt, snorting, his body tense with the memory of falling. For a long while, he would not move. Ethan could feel his own patience thinning, but he bit back the urge to push. Instead, he walked back across the ditch and stood beside Smokey. Together they stared at the hollow in the earth. Ethan placed a hand against the horse's warm neck and said, "It's not about the jump. It's about standing here until you believe you can." They stood there until the stars appeared, and though Smokey never crossed that ditch that night, he did not turn away either. That, Ethan realized, was its own kind of victory. The harvest ended, and neighbors celebrated with pies cooling on windowsills and children running through the empty fields. Ethan and Lily walked home from town carrying a loaf of bread wrapped in paper, the gift of a farmer who had watched Ethan hauling hay all week. Smokey waited in the corral, ears forward, as though sensing that even the smallest generosity from the outside world was meant for them too. That night, Ethan leaned against the stall rail, the lantern flickering across the chestnut's coat. "You're teaching me more than I'm teaching you," he whispered. "About patience. About standing still when the world wants you to move faster. Maybe that's the lesson we both need." Smokey pressed his muzzle into Ethan's shoulder, a gesture gentle and certain. And in that moment, the barn felt less like a burden and more like a sanctuary. The boy who had been called foolish and the horse who had been called useless were finding their own way through the lessons the land itself offered, slow, steady, and carved in the quiet of harvest nights. Snow had not yet fallen, but the air already carried the promise of it. The mornings were brittle with frost, and Ethan's breath clouded as he pushed open the door of the feed store. Bells over the frame jingled, announcing him to the room where ranchers lingered with their coffee, their voices low and edged with laughter. He kept his head down as he made for the counter, but the words drifted through the air, unavoidable. "They say Coleman's bringing his stallion to the fair this year," one man remarked, slapping his gloves against his thigh. "Fastest thing in the valley, trained by the best. Ain't no competition worth betting on." Another chuckled. "I heard he's opening the race to anyone brave enough to lose. Says he wants the whole county to witness what a real horse looks like." The laughter rolled, and Ethan's stomach tightened. He paid for the grain with crumpled bills and turned to leave, but one of the men called after him. "Hey, Miller. Maybe you should bring that short-legged chestnut of yours. Give the crowd a good laugh before the real show starts." He didn't answer. Outside, he shouldered the sack of grain and walked to the truck, each step heavy. Smokey was waiting at home, ears pricked, hungry as always. Ethan thought of those mocking voices following him all the way down Main Street, sticking like burrs to his skin. That evening, he fed Smokey in silence. Lily noticed, sitting on the fence with her boots kicking the rail. "You heard about the fair, didn't you?" she asked, her tone half accusation, half concern. Ethan nodded, brushing the horse's flank with slow strokes. The chestnut shifted, nudging his arm as if to remind him of the present moment, not the words hanging in the air miles away. "Yeah," Ethan said at last. "Coleman's making a spectacle out of it." Lily leaned forward, her braid swinging. "Then go. Show them Smokey isn't what they think." Ethan shook his head, almost laughing, but without humor. "We're not ready." He still stumbles. "We don't even have proper tack, just hand-me-downs." "They'll eat us alive," Lily's eyes glowed stubborn in the fading light. "They already laugh, Ethan. But you and Smokey, you've been proving them wrong every day. Maybe it's time to let everyone else see it too." Later, at supper, Helen spoke little, her spoon moving slow in the stew. But when she looked up, her eyes found Ethan's, sharp as flint. "Your father chased rodeo dreams until they took him from us. Be careful what you chase." Ethan swallowed hard, setting down his spoon. "This isn't about chasing glory. It's about showing they don't get to decide who matters and who doesn't." The kitchen went still, the only sound the tick of the old clock. At last Helen sighed, her voice softer. "If you do this, do it with your head, not just your pride. And don't forget, when you fall, you're not the only one who pays the price." That night, Ethan lay awake, listening to the wind scrape against the walls. He thought of Travis's smirk, of the men in the feed store, of his father's empty chair at the table. But he also thought of Smokey's steady breath, of Lily's laughter echoing across the pasture, of the way the chestnut never turned away no matter how hard the work. By dawn, he had made his choice. In the gray light, he stood in the barn with Smokey and whispered, "We'll do it. Not for them, not even for me, for us." The horse's ears flicked, and he shifted closer, warm breath fogging in the chill. The rumor of the fair was no longer just noise in town. It had become a challenge that echoed inside Ethan's chest. And though fear gnawed at the edges of his resolve, something stronger held firm, the belief that maybe, just maybe, The world needed to see what a boy and a short-legged horse could become together. The decision to enter the fair changed everything. From the moment Ethan whispered that vow to Smokey, life on the Miller farm shifted into a harsher rhythm. Each dawn now brought not only chores and school runs for Lily, not only the endless grind at the gas station, but a weight heavier than all of it, the knowledge that they were training against time, against doubt, and against the jeering eyes of the county. Ethan built obstacles out of what little he had. Rusted barrels rolled into lines, fallen logs dragged from the creek bed, old fence posts hammered into the frozen ground. The corral became a rough practice track, uneven and unforgiving. But it was theirs. Smokey's hooves struck sparks of determination with each lap, his chestnut coat darkening with sweat as Ethan pushed him a little further every day. It wasn't easy. Some evenings, Ethan's body ached so fiercely from stacking grain sacks and fueling trucks that he could hardly lift the saddle. Yet he did, gritting his teeth as he swung it onto Smokey's back. He learned to read the gelding's breathing, to sense when the horse was close to breaking and when he was ready for one more push. Trust had been fragile once, but now it became a lifeline. Ethan could not demand more than Smokey could give, and Smokey, in turn, seemed to answer with a growing will to try. The valley, however, was not kind. Snow flurries began to sweep across the fields, dusting the ground with white and icing the logs that served as jumps. More than once, Smokey slipped, legs scrambling, and Ethan's heart lunged into his throat. He learned to temper the pace, to remind himself that the goal was not to match Coleman's sleek stallion stride for stride, but to endure, to adapt. Lily was their constant audience. Wrapped in her too-big coat, she brought cocoa in tin mugs and shouted encouragement from the fence line. "He's faster, Ethan. Did you see? He's really faster." Her belief seemed endless, untouched by the scorn of town gossip. Sometimes she would run alongside the corral, her breath puffing like Smokey's, her laughter ringing clearer than any cheer they might hope for at the fair. Helen's worry deepened. She mended Ethan's gloves at night, her fingers stiff with age, but her words carried the weight of warning. "A horse can break more than bones when pushed too far," she told him one evening, the lamplight drawing deep lines in her face. Ethan only nodded, knowing she wasn't speaking just of horses. The strain took its toll. Ethan's hands blistered, the skin cracked from rope and cold. His boots split at the seams. More than once he stumbled through a shift at the gas station, customers eyeing him with faint amusement as he fought to stay awake on his feet. But when the sun dipped and he turned back into the drive, the sight of Smokey waiting at the fence erased every ache. The horse would whicker softly, ears forward, as if to say, "We're still in this together." One evening, after a grueling run, Smokey slowed to a halt, chest heaving. Ethan slid from the saddle, his own breath ragged, and rested his forehead against the horse's damp neck. "They think we're a joke," he murmured, voice hoarse. "Let's give them something they'll never forget." Smokey answered with a deep, steady breath, his body trembling but unbroken. The bond between them no longer felt tentative. It felt forged in fire and strain, hammered into something stronger than either of them alone. And though the fair still loomed like a storm on the horizon, Ethan found himself standing taller in those days. He had no illusions of easy victories, but each morning he rose, and each night he trained, was proof that laughter could be answered. Not with words, but with endurance, carved out of the hardest days of their lives. The wind had calmed by evening, leaving the Miller farm wrapped in a heavy stillness. Snow threatened, but held back, the clouds crouching low over the horizon like watchful beasts. Ethan finished the last of the chores in silence, stacking kindling by the porch, checking the latch on the chicken coop, walking the perimeter of the fence as though preparing for more than a county fair. His boots crunched in the frozen dirt, and each sound seemed louder in the hush of anticipation. Smokey stood in the barn, his chestnut coat gleaming from the careful brushing Ethan had given him. The horse shifted restlessly, as if sensing what tomorrow would bring. Ethan leaned on the stall door, his fingers tracing the worn wood, and whispered, "Tomorrow, everyone's eyes will be on us. Doesn't matter if they laugh. We'll be there." Inside the kitchen, Helen stirred a pot of stew, her movements slow, deliberate. Lily sat at the table, chin propped in her hands, her eyes glowing with excitement. "Will he wear the bridle with the silver buckle?" she asked, unable to keep her voice low. Ethan nodded, though he smiled faintly. "It's old, but it'll shine enough." Helen set the spoon down, her gaze heavy on him. "Remember, Ethan, this isn't just about proving them wrong. Don't push him into breaking just to quiet their jeers. Pride has already cost this family more than we could afford." The words cut deep, bringing back the image of his father's empty chair, the silence that had filled the house since that night years ago. Ethan swallowed hard. This isn't about pride. It's about showing that the ones they call nothing can still stand in the ring. The meal passed quietly after that. When Lily drifted to sleep, excitement wearing her down, and Helen banked the fire for the night, Ethan pulled on his coat again and stepped outside. The cold struck him sharp, but he walked straight to the barn. Smokey raised his head as the lantern light spilled across the straw, ears pricked. Ethan entered the stall and sat down on the edge of the hay pile, his back against the boards. Smokey shifted closer, lowering his head until his breath fogged against Ethan's hair. The boy reached up and rested his hand on the horse's jaw. "Tomorrow won't be easy. Coleman's horse is bigger, faster, trained by men who know more than I ever will. But none of them know you like I do. None of them know how hard you've tried." He sat there for a long time, the barn settling around them, the rafters groaning in the cold. He thought of the faces that would crowd the fairground, of Travis's smirk, of the men who had laughed in the feed store. Fear tightened his chest, but beside it burned something steadier, the memory of foggy mornings, of falls and apologies, of harvest nights where patience mattered more than speed. The horse shifted again, nudging Ethan's shoulder. The boy let out a shaky laugh, the sound breaking the heaviness. "You're right. Worry won't win us anything. All we have to do is show up. The rest will follow." When at last Ethan stood to leave, he turned down the lantern and let the dark reclaim the barn. Smokey whickered softly, the sound low and certain. Ethan paused at the stall door, taking in the shape of the chestnut against the shadows, and felt the weight of tomorrow settle on his shoulders. Back in his room, he lay down fully clothed, boots by the bed, heart still pounding with the rhythm of hooves only he could hear. Outside, the first flakes of snow began to fall, quiet and relentless, as if the sky itself was holding its breath for what dawn would bring. The fairground stirred long before sunrise. By the time Ethan pulled the truck into the muddy lot, lanterns were already swinging from poles, smoke from food stalls curling into the pale sky, and the steady rumble of engines and hooves filled the morning air. It was the kind of noise that pressed into the chest, a mixture of celebration and challenge. Ethan tightened his grip on the steering wheel, glancing at Smokey in the mirror. The chestnut shifted in the trailer, ears flicking nervously at the clamor. Lily leaned forward from the passenger seat, her breath fogging the window. "It's bigger than I thought," she whispered, eyes wide at the rows of tents and the flags snapping in the wind. Helen, seated quietly in the back, said nothing. Her gaze stayed fixed on the horizon, unreadable as the dawn itself. They parked near the practice ring, where polished horses moved like fluid bronze under the hands of seasoned riders. Coleman's stallion stood out even from a distance, his black coat shining like oil, muscles taut as he tossed his head. Travis sat tall in the saddle, already grinning at the crowd gathered to admire. Their eyes swept past Ethan's old truck, dismissing it before they even saw the horse inside. Ethan opened the trailer and guided Smokey down the ramp. The chestnut blinked at the chaos, nostrils flaring, his breath steaming in the cold. A ripple of laughter drifted from a nearby group of boys. "That's the one? The famous short legs?" one sneered. Another chuckled. "Maybe they'll let him carry the ribbons instead of chasing them." Ethan ignored them, focusing on Smokey's trembling. He stroked the horse's neck, voice low. "It's just noise, boy." Nothing we haven't heard before. The announcer's voice soon boomed over the loudspeakers, calling riders to the ring for inspection. Drums from the marching band echoed across the grounds, mingling with the cheers of children chasing balloons. The sound struck Smokey like a storm. He flinched hard, pulling against the rope, his eyes wide. Ethan braced, whispering calm, steady words, grounding them both. Lily hurried to his side, holding out a carrot she had hidden in her coat pocket. Smokey's nostrils quivered, and he reached for it, chewing slowly. The tension in his body eased, if only slightly. "See?" Lily whispered. "He just needs to know we're here." When they entered the warm-up ring, Travis and Coleman were already there, the stallion trotting with effortless power. Travis turned his horse toward Ethan, a smirk plastered across his face. "Didn't think you'd actually show," he called, his voice carrying over the ring. "This ought to be fun." Ethan didn't answer. He mounted Smokey, settling into the worn saddle that had been patched more times than he could count. The chestnut sidestepped nervously, but Ethan kept his weight balanced, his hands gentle. Around them, riders whispered, some in pity, some in derision. But the boy and the horse moved forward anyway, circling the ring with quiet determination. The crowd gathered quickly as the announcer listed the competitors. Flags whipped in the wind, children perched on their fathers' shoulders, and the scent of roasted corn drifted through the air. It was a carnival for most, but for Ethan and Smokey, it was a crucible. When their names were finally called, Ethan leaned forward, his lips close to Smokey's ear. "This is it. No matter what happens, we ride together." The gelding flicked an ear, his muscles twitching beneath Ethan's legs. The drums beat louder, the announcer's voice rose, and the gates swung wide. Travis's stallion surged forward, drawing cheers. Ethan gave Smokey a gentle squeeze, and though the chestnut's stride was shorter, his heart carried him out into the roar of the fairground. For a moment, as hooves struck earth and the crowd's voices rose like thunder, Ethan no longer felt small. He was simply a rider, astride his horse, facing the world head-on. And in Smokey's dark eyes, there was no fear, only the steady fire of one who had already survived worse than laughter. The starting horn split the cold air, and the ground shook beneath a dozen pounding hooves. Travis's black stallion lunged forward, devouring the track with a stride so powerful it drew gasps from the crowd. Ethan and Smokey surged after them, but the difference was immediate, short legs against long, raw grit against polish. The laughter that rose from the rail stung Ethan's ears, but he bent low, whispering into the chestnut's mane, "Don't listen. Just keep moving." The course wound through the fairground's outer field, dotted with jumps and ditches set to test both horse and rider. Lights strung from poles cast uneven shadows, and the drums from the marching band still rattled the air, each beat a reminder of eyes fixed on them. Smokey stumbled on the first bend, his hooves sliding in the churned dirt, but Ethan steadied him with a firm hand and gentle pressure. The horse righted himself, breath coming hard, and pushed on. Travis glanced back, a grin stretched wide across his face. He leaned low, urging his stallion to greater speed, showboating for the crowd. The black horse soared over the first high jump, landing smooth and effortless. Cheers erupted. Then all eyes shifted to Ethan and Smokey. The chestnut approached the obstacle, ears flicking nervously. Ethan could feel the hesitation in the gelding's muscles, the memory of falls clawing at them both. He loosened his grip, let his weight sink deep in the saddle, and whispered, "Trust yourself, Smokey. You can do this." At the last second, Smokey gathered, legs bunching, and launched. His body cleared the rail, not with elegance, but with fierce will. The landing was rough, his hooves striking hard, but he stayed upright. A roar rose from the crowd. Not laughter this time, but surprise. Ethan clung to that sound like a lifeline. The next obstacle loomed. A wide ditch, dark and shadowed, more intimidating than any they had faced at home. Travis's stallion flew over it, landing with ease, and Travis threw a mocking glance over his shoulder. Ethan felt Smokey falter beneath him, the stride breaking as the gelding saw the void. The crowd grew tense, whispers slicing through the night air. Ethan's throat tightened. He remembered the hours standing beside this very fear, waiting for courage to rise. Now there was no time to wait. He leaned close, his voice raw and urgent. "It's not the jump, boy. It's us. We do it together." Smokey surged forward, heart louder than the drums. He leapt, not graceful, not clean, but desperate and determined. For a breathless instant, they hung in the air, suspended between failure and faith. Then hooves struck earth. The gelding staggered, almost fell, but Ethan's balance held, and Smokey found his legs again. The crowd erupted in gasps, then cheers, the sound rolling like thunder. Something changed in that moment. Smokey's ears pricked forward, his stride lengthening as though the fear had burned away. He didn't match the stallion's speed, but his rhythm grew steadier, his confidence building with each stride. The laughter was gone now, replaced by awe. Travis's grin faltered as he realized the boy and the horse he had mocked were still behind him, still pressing on. Ethan didn't care about the distance between them. He only cared about the fire beneath him, the steady, unyielding heart that carried them forward. As they cleared the final turn, the finish line stretched ahead, lights blazing. The stallion remained in the lead, victory nearly certain. But the noise that rose from the stands wasn't for the polished favorite. It was for the chestnut who had leapt into darkness and landed in defiance of every doubt. Ethan leaned forward, his voice breaking with pride. "That's it, Smokey. They see you now." And together they thundered toward the line, not as the fastest, not as the finest, but as the pair who had refused to be broken. They did not win. The black stallion crossed first, the ribbon fluttering against Travis's fist as he rose in the stirrups and soaked in the noise, But the sound that rolled across the grandstand was not for him. It swelled as Smokey pounded down the last straight, the chestnut's breath tearing the cold air, Ethan low and calm over his withers, both of them arriving at the finish like a promise kept. Ethan eased Smokey to a jog, then a walk. The world rushed back in. Drums, announcer, the clatter of hooves, and then it softened, as if the fair itself chose to step aside and allow silence to sit between boy and horse. Smokey's ears flicked. He was shaking, not with fear now, but with the shock of having done the thing he'd once refused to believe he could do. Ethan slid a hand along the hot neck, felt the slick dampness, the tremor of effort. "You did it," he whispered, voice ragged. "You really did." At the rail, Lily shouted his name until her voice broke, both hands cupped to her mouth. Helen did not shout. She simply stood. Straighter than Ethan had seen in years, her eyes so bright the winter light couldn't dull them. The two of them met his gaze and held it, and something old and heavy lifted in his chest. They circled toward the inn gate. Travis and his father waited there, a sheen of satisfaction on their faces. The stallion tossed his head, dark mane snapping like a banner. Travis offered a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Cute show, Miller. Folks love an underdog." Ethan nodded once, the way a man acknowledges whether he can't change. Smokey shifted, catching the scent of roasting corn and hot iron from the farrier's tent, ears swiveling toward the clatter of the midway. Ethan patted his neck. "Good run," he said to Travis, because it cost him nothing and gave away less. A tap on the microphone crackled through the speakers. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer boomed, "before we present the race ribbon, the judges wish to recognize a competitor whose courage captured this arena. This year's Heart of the Horse honor goes to rider Ethan Miller and his gelding, Smokey." For a breath, the fair held still. Then the sound rose, shoulders lifting, hands clapping, boots stomping the planks. Ethan felt it pass through him like warmth after a long winter. He guided Smokey forward. A woman in a wool coat stepped into the ring with a small plaque and a ribbon the color of dusk. Up close, her face held that look of people who have seen something true and are glad to be reminded it exists. She pinned the ribbon to the bridle's worn cheekpiece. "You two changed the air in here," she said quietly. "Not many manage that." Ethan murmured thank you, but the words felt too small for the moment. Smokey breathed against his sleeve, searching for his hand. He gave it without thinking. Near the exit, a boy about Lily's age reached through the rail to stroke Smokey's nose. "He's short," the boy said, the fact plain and harmless, "but he looks like he could carry the whole world." His father laughed softly and squeezed his shoulder. Someone nearby started telling a story about a gelding that saved a rancher in a blizzard, and another voice answered with details about equine veterinary care and winter feed. The fair absorbed Ethan and Smokey the way fields absorb the first thaw, quietly, without ceremony, making room for what comes next. On the way back to the trailer, Travis rode past, the stallion's shoes ringing like coins on a plate. Coleman leaned from the rail and called, "You did more with less than most men do with everything. Keep him sound, son." It wasn't praise so much as admission, and that was plenty. They loaded for home in the thin, early twilight. Snow threatened again, but it had the decency to wait until they turned up the Miller Drive, the first flakes drifting big and lazy across the windshield. Lily ran ahead to swing the gate. Helen opened the trailer and stepped back as Smokey walked down, careful and dignified, the ribbon dark against his chestnut face. She reached up and touched it with the back of her fingers, as if checking a fever. "Well," she said, "look at that." Inside, the kitchen steamed with the sweet smell of cocoa. They drank standing up, hands around warm mugs, steam fogging the window that looked toward the barn. No one spoke at first. They didn't need to. Lily finally set her mug down with a thunk and blurted, "He flew, Grandma." He really flew. Helen smiled with only one side of her mouth. The good ones don't need wings to leave the ground. Ethan pulled on a fresh jacket and went back to the barn with a stack of towels. He rubbed Smokey down, slow and thorough, listening to the breath deepen. The muscles let go. The gelding dropped his head and leaned his weight just enough to be felt. Ethan let him. "You carried me through tonight," he said. "Maybe I carried something for you, too." Outside, the snow thickened, softening the edges of everything. Inside, the lantern cast a quiet sun over straw and wood and chestnut hair. Neighbors began to stop by over the next week. They came with extra hay or a used winter blanket, with awkward compliments and stories they'd been meaning to tell. A local reporter asked for a photo by the fence. The feed store owner sent a note that said, "Tab forgiven through January. Consider it a sponsorship." Ethan tacked it to the kitchen wall because he liked the way the word looked next to the grocery list and Lily's spelling words. A rancher from the far side of the valley dropped off a flyer for lessons at his arena. "You could teach little kids to ride on weekends," he said, scratching his cheek, pretending the offer wasn't kindness. Helen mentioned, in her practical way, that if folks were going to be coming and going, they might want to look at proper ranch property insurance in the spring. The world, she said, had a habit of changing faster than fences can be mended. They didn't speak of winning anymore. That word had shrunk after the fair, too, small for what they'd chosen to build. On Saturday, Ethan led Smokey to the field beyond the barn, where thin snow lay in rippled sheets. Lily trudged after them with a broom to brush the icy patches from a circle. They worked there, quiet and steady, the chestnut's stride patient, the boy's hands light. At the far fence line, a red-tailed hawk lifted from a post, its shadow floating over them like a blessing. When they paused, Ethan rested his forehead against Smokey's and closed his eyes. He didn't see the fairground or Travis or the black stallion's clean takeoff. He saw fog lifting from pasture grass, a ditch faced in the dark, a night of apology, the kitchen window steaming on a winter morning. He saw the shape of a life he could live with. A plain one, yes, but honest. With work that puts itself in your hands and asks for patience more than talent. Spring came in its own time. The ground softened, the ditch they'd feared filled with clear water, and wildflowers freckled the pasture like constellations fallen to earth. Ethan hung a hand-lettered sign on the front fence. Saturday riding. Beginner lessons. Kids showed up shy and loud in equal measure, and Smokey lowered his head for every one of them, solemn as a church bell. Lily took to walking beside the smallest riders, her hand steady on their calf, talking in a whisper like Ethan did when the world felt too big. Some afternoons, Helen sat on the porch with a paperback and pretended not to listen to the lines Ethan used. Soft words weighed out like seed grain. "We're not in a hurry," he'd say. "We follow your feet." Parents would line up by the fence, the talk drifting from school to hay prices to farm insurance policies, and once in a while someone would remark, almost to themselves, that the chestnut with the short legs moved like a horse who had already arrived at where he was going. They did not become rich. The roof still needed fixing, the truck still groaned, and bills still arranged themselves into small, certain stacks. But abundance found its way through the cracks. Freshly baked bread on a Tuesday, a neighbor leaving a sack of sweet feed by the gate at dusk, the way Smokey stood closer now when thunder rolled, not because he was braver, but because he had chosen where to put his fear. On a warm evening, months after the fair, Ethan led Smokey to the ridge where the pasture lifted into sky. They stood watching the town below turn to gold as the sun pressed itself thin against the far hills. Lily ran up the slope and flopped into the grass, arms spread like she meant to hold the whole light in her hands. Helen climbed slower, pausing to catch her breath, and when she reached them, she hooked her arm through Ethan's the way she had when he was small. Smokey blew a soft breath, the sound like a page turning. Ethan rubbed the star on his forehead, where the winter ribbon had once brushed. "You were never the wrong horse," he said. "I was just late. To the right story." They watched until the sun slipped, until the grass surrendered its color, and the sky took up the work of keeping things visible. It felt like nothing was happening. No music, no speeches, no bright ribbon to prove a moment had mattered. The wind breathed across the grass and carried the clean smell of evening. Lily's fingers found Smokey's forelock and braided it badly, and Helen rested her head against Ethan's shoulder. In that quiet, everything had changed. And now, I'd love to hear from you. If this story touched your heart, just drop a simple 0 or 1 in the comments. It's our secret way to know you're part of this journey. Don't forget to subscribe, because many more stories of courage, love, and second chances between people and horses are waiting for you. Stay with us and let the next story find you.